Can you really find happiness if your freedom involves disconnecting yourself from your entire family?
Sometimes people can work these things out if there's the willingness on both sides, and people do make mistakes. And I do believe Harry made some mistakes. That goes both ways. People can work it out, and sometimes they can't. And sometimes people find freedom in having to disconnect. In the book, The Myth of Normal, I talk about this tension that we all have between authentic and belonging, attachment and authenticity. If we can belong and connect and be our true selves, that's ideal. But what do we do if in order to be our true selves, our families or our communities won't accept us? Well, I made a decision a long time ago that for me, speaking the truth, which doesn't make me right, but speaking my truth is more important than who likes me and who doesn't like me. In 1967, I wrote an article after the war arguing by that time that Israel had occupied these territories quite deliberately and then never give them back. My father kicked me out of the house. I accepted that. Now, my father later on came around and actually agreed with me. But I made the decision that to be myself and to speak my truth, I'm willing to break the contact if that's what it took. A lot of people in that situation, and Harry in that family with a very troubled young mother and a loveless marriage, and a father who was having an affair before he was born, a family that was not a whole lot of touching and holding. There's multiple reasons to say that he was a very traumatized child, and in order to become himself, he had to distance himself. Now, did he do it right? Exactly the ideal way? Maybe not, but you know what? When I look at myself at age 38 or 35, boy, did I make a lot of mistakes.
The moment Piers Morgan delivered his question, you could feel the tension shift in the air. He leaned forward with that familiar confidence he carries whenever he thinks he's finally found the winning blow. He asked whether anyone could truly find happiness if their so-called freedom required distancing themselves from their entire family. It was said with the expectation that the question alone would expose Harry, corner him, reduce him to a man running from responsibility rather than a man running toward healing. But sitting across from him was Dr. Gabor Maté, and the answer that came back was nothing like what Piers expected. Dr. Maté didn't hesitate, didn't soften the truth, didn't tiptoe around the emotional weight of the question. Instead, he gave a response that landed with the clarity of lived experience. He spoke about truth in a way that silenced the room. He explained that speaking one's truth is not about being right, nor about pleasing others, nor about maintaining appearances. It is about survival. It is about alignment. It is about refusing to let the world dictate the limits of your emotional life. And he made it clear that stepping away from a family, even a royal one, is not an act of abandonment when that environment is the very thing keeping you emotionally imprisoned. What stunned Piers the most was that Dr. Maté didn't speak about this in abstract terms. He brought his own story forward, a story of being kicked out of his home as a teenager for daring to speak honestly. He had lived the consequences of truth-telling. He knew the weight of being disliked simply because you refused to betray yourself. And in that moment, the parallel between his past and Harry's present was undeniable. Harry's decision to step back, to speak openly, to break the silence was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of survival. It was the only way for him to become himself. And as Dr. Maté spoke, the conversation shifted from entertainment to revelation. He described Harry as a deeply traumatized child, someone who spent his life performing roles assigned to him without ever being given the emotional space to understand his own inner world. A boy who lost his mother in front of millions, who was told to walk behind her coffin as though grief could be contained for the sake of ceremony. A boy who was expected to return to public life almost immediately, smile for cameras, and keep moving as though nothing inside him had shattered. And it was only as an adult, decades later, that he began to understand how much of that pain he had swallowed. When you grow up inside an institution that values silence more than healing, obedience more than honesty, and appearances more than emotional truth, walking away is not betrayal. Walking away is liberation. Harry wasn't choosing isolation, he was choosing life. He wasn't pushing family away, he was pulling himself out of a system that numbed his pain instead of treating it. And for the first time in his life, someone sitting across from a television host spoke that truth plainly. The world has spent years pretending Harry's departure was impulsive or selfish, but the truth is far more heartbreaking. Harry wasn't running from responsibility. He was running from a pattern that had consumed generations before him. A pattern where duty meant silence, silence meant suppression, and suppression meant slow emotional decay. For Harry, remaining inside that world would have meant repeating the cycle that destroyed his mother. And he refused to let his children grow up in the same shadow that shaped his childhood. So when people ask why he left, the real question should be, how could he stay? Harry's critics always claim he abandoned his family, but what he actually abandoned was the version of himself that was designed for them, the persona, the puppet, the spare whose emotions were considered unnecessary, the man who was expected to tolerate the press, absorb the blows, stay quiet, and smile on command. He abandoned the role, not the principle of family, and that distinction is everything. Dr. Maté understood this instantly. He saw Harry not as a prince, not as a public figure, but as a man who finally confronted his pain head-on. He saw that Harry's honesty wasn't a weapon, it was a lifeline. He saw that Harry wasn't causing damage, he was preventing it. When you grow up with unaddressed trauma, the patterns repeat themselves unless you break them intentionally. And breaking them requires distance. Healing requires protection. Growth requires removing yourself from environments that demand you shrink. Harry's decision to speak first and foremost protected his children. It ensured that Archie and Lilibet would grow up with parents who understood emotional safety, communication, and softness. Things Harry had to learn the hard way. He didn't leave his family, he left the dysfunction. He left the coldness. He left the tradition of silence that had suffocated him since childhood. He left because staying would have cost him the future he now holds in his hands. And this is precisely why people like Piers Morgan have never been able to tolerate Harry's truth. Because once Harry told his own story, the press lost its control. They couldn't twist his narrative anymore, couldn't decide who he was, couldn't frame him as the reckless spare to distract from more convenient storylines. Harry took back ownership of his identity, something that no tabloid, no commentator, no royal protocol could ever have prepared for. And when someone reclaims their voice, the people who once silenced them panic. But Harry didn't panic. He grew. He confronted his past, sought therapy, unpacked decades of emotional wounds, and rebuilt himself piece by piece. He learned what he had never been taught, that his feelings were valid, his trauma was real, and his healing was not optional but necessary. This is what terrifies his critics, the realization that Harry became a whole man the moment he stepped away from the palace walls, that he found clarity the moment he stopped performing, that he discovered joy the moment he stopped living for the approval of institutions that benefited from his silence. And, it all began with one simple but devastatingly honest truth. The life he was born into was killing him emotionally. When Dr. Maté said Harry had been a deeply traumatized child, it wasn't an attack. It was a recognition that the world had watched Harry suffer for years and pretended not to see it. A recognition that the little boy walking behind Diana's coffin never truly had a chance to heal. A recognition that everything Harry has done since then, every interview, every decision, every boundary, was built on the necessity of breaking cycles that had consumed his family for generations. People who don't understand healing call it betrayal. People who fear honesty call it oversharing. People who cling to dysfunction call it rebellion. But honestly, Harry's journey is none of those things. Harry's journey is the story of a man reclaiming his identity after a lifetime of being told who he should be. It is the story of a man rising out of shadows that were never his to carry. It is the story of a man choosing truth over tradition, peace over performance, and love over legacy.